draft IRP and supplemental environmental impact statement. That's a mouthful. Presentation, and we want to let you know that we're going to start off the evening with two presentations, followed by a question and answer period. And we're going to have a clock up here that'll help us make sure we stay on time. Everybody gets 2 minutes to talk. And again, we appreciate your being here tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to Vice President Joe Hoechlin, who is Vice President of Stakeholder Relations and Innovative Technology. Technology Innovation. Take it away.
Yeah, so welcome everybody. Looks like we got a really good crowd. Appreciate everybody coming. Sorry for the kind of interesting makeup of the room here. We're kind of dual purposing the room. But we do appreciate everybody coming. We're pretty excited. We're wanting to share with everybody our integrated resource plan, our draft results. And in just a few minutes, the guys that are really smart will be up here to talk about exactly what those results look like and where we think we're heading. But just kind of as a reminder, you know, the integrated resource plan for us as a utility is really figuring out how we're going to provide generation for growing load in the future. All of us as consumers, we use more load all the time. Things are getting more efficient, but we keep finding new ways to use electricity. And we have to figure out how to meet that load with different generation sources. And the interesting thing about electricity when you do that is when you make electricity, you have to use electricity. So there's no way to store it very well at this point. Those technologies are coming, but they're not here yet. So it's important that we be able to match those the use that we all want to have with those resources in real time and very quickly. So we're going to talk about how we're going to do that tonight and how we think that'll happen. The other reason it's really important is the resources that we usually employ are usually very long-lived, usually quite expensive to implement, and you know, if you get any of that wrong, it generally ends up costing a lot. And obviously the first thing it ends up costing is everybody in this room, because at the end of the day it ends up affecting rates. So again, we do appreciate everybody.
Gary's in charge of the IRP for us, and he's been spearheading this effort for a good 18 months. Gary, take it away.
Okay, so start with, I just want to reinforce what Kathy's already said about the way the evening is going to go. We're going to start with this presentation. Should take us about between 30 and 40 minutes, and then we'll use the balance of the evening for questions and answers. And we're going to ask you, I know it's a little awkward looking, but again, as Joe said, we're kind of repurposing this room, so we're going to ask you when it's time for you to answer your question, come around over here so you can talk into the microphone so everybody in the room can hear your question. And we'll do our best to answer that over here. And so that leads me actually to the second safety moment, which is there's a cord right here on the floor, okay, that runs our little light display. So be careful when you're coming up to answer your question that you don't have an adventure getting across that cord. I will probably trip over before the night is over, so try not to do it. So what I want to do is I want you to start by thinking about where you're going to be 20 years from now and what you'll be doing. Will you still be working? Where will you be living? What's your life going to be like in 20 years? Most of us don't think that far ahead. But at TVA, we think that far ahead all the time, especially about our resource plan. And that's actually, we're having a little brown. No. Just kidding. So we think that far ahead all the time with our resource plan because we have to be able to plan ahead for the future of energy supply in the Tennessee Valley. And so if we do that visioning process, what is it that we see in the future for the Tennessee Valley? And we think our energy supply is going to be first still affordable and reliable and sustainable like it's been through our history at TVA. but we think the way we're going to deliver that power to you is going to change. We're going to see more cost-effective energy efficiency as part of our portfolio. We're going to see more solar and wind power and less coal. Natural gas is going to play a bigger role than it does today. But through all of that transformation, we'll continue to be able to drive economic prosperity and economic development here in the valley. Now, we didn't learn all that stuff in a crystal ball, though. We used a much better tool. We used the Integrated Resource Plan. The IRP is a study about how we imagine that energy supply to evolve over a long period of time in multiple alternative possible futures. So what we're going to talk to you a little bit about tonight is what we've learned through all of that analysis. So the first thing we want to talk about is our mission. TVA's mission is fully considered and evaluated as part of our IRP analysis. So we think about energy and the environment and economic development, and we do that by balancing what we call strategic imperatives that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. So we think about our debt cap and our debt limit. Our analysis respects that debt cap and shifts costs if they need to be shifted into rates. And then we have metrics in the IRP that help us measure that rate pressure. So we get an idea about whether the plans we're thinking about are likely to put upward or downward pressure on rates. So we keep those two kind of competing sides of the box there kind of in mind. At the same time, we're also looking at the other two sides of the box. The IRP really is all about optimizing our asset portfolio, trying to decide what the right mix is over this long period of time. At the same time, we have to respect our stewardship obligations. TVA has an obligation to the Tennessee Valley that goes beyond making electricity. And the IRP recognizes that responsibility by looking beyond just compliance issues around the environment to actually look at what our impact on air, water, and solid waste production is. We use a lot of things for a successful study, but one of the most important things is stakeholder engagement and public involvement. We think it's the thing that makes our IRP so successful. In fact, tonight we've got several members of our stakeholder working group are here. We've also got the chairman of one of our advisory councils is also here tonight. So they've played a tremendously important role for us. You can see that we actually started this process back in the the fall of 2013. The project team feels like it's been 20 years. But from the very beginning, we've asked our stakeholders, particularly in the working group, to kind of journey with us. I tell them that they're watching us make the sausage. And then at a bunch of other places during our process, we give the opportunity for the public to interact with us. We've had some public briefings. We started with public scoping, and now we're traveling around the valley in meetings like this one tonight, allowing valley residents and our customers to come and talk to us about what they think the draft IRP and the general direction that we're headed. So the IRP does play an important role at TVA, but it plays a role that's a little different maybe than some of our other investor-owned utilities, our peers around the region might think of an IRP. We think of the IRP like a compass and not like a GPS. So what the IRP does is point us in a strategic direction, gives us a general idea of where we want our generation portfolio to go, but it doesn't decide specifically about what unit to build in what city in what year. That kind of detail comes in the follow-on analysis once our board actually adopts the broad direction that the IRP is setting out for us. What it will do is help us understand what least cost options we should be thinking about. And it also helps us think about risk and uncertainty and how to manage those. But it doesn't help us set our rates, and it won't tell us where we're going to build our next unit. So, broad direction without being very specific. That gives us a lot of flexibility when it comes time to implement the vision for our resource use. Our planning process uses industry standard tools. We have some best practice applications that we use with those tools. All of our data gets third-party review and independent validation so that we're confident that the data we put in will provide us good directional information. At the end of the day, the plans that we generate as a result of this exercise need to meet the 6 goals that you see on the right-hand side of that slide. We've got to be low cost and reliable because that's kind of the heart of who we are at TVA. We have to be risk informed. Now that's a fancy way of saying we need to know where our risks are. We need to know what drives that risk so we can decide whether we want to own that risk or we want to mitigate it. Environmental responsibility is a key part of our mission, and so all of our plans have to keep that in mind. As I said before, this is beyond compliance. This is about what our impact is on the valley. Plans have got to be diverse. Now, our CEO, Bill Johnson, usually talks about the balanced portfolio. It's the same idea. We want to make sure that we don't have all our generation eggs in one basket, so that if the future evolves in a way that we hadn't expected, we don't end up regretting something that we've done in this plan. And lastly, that plan's got to be flexible so that when the future does change, our system is able to respond to those uncertainties, especially around customer demand and things like that. That flexibility gets more and more important as we move away from what old utility planners like me would think of as traditional kind of generation resources like central station power plants. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. Innovation is the key, one of the keys to our success in the IRP. TVA actually has a long history of innovation, and I didn't actually know this until I started putting this presentation together. We actually started in the 1940s research around fertilizer. And so our efforts around innovation have gone on since then. The IRP is just another example of how we apply innovation to the work that we do at TVA. So we look very hard at new energy technologies and new ways to analyze that. And in the 2015 IRP, we especially used some very state-of-the-art kind of methodology around how to assess energy efficiency and make sure that that resource is part of the portfolio, and also how to encourage more renewables to be selected in our plans. But at the same time, we kind of temper all that enthusiasm around innovation with the recognition that we've got an obligation to our customers. So we think about risk, especially around cost and performance, so that while we're innovating, we don't end up loading up our portfolio with a lot of really cool technology that may or may not work. One of the things we have to deal with in the IRP, because it's a long-range study, it's a 20-year plan. So there's 2 things that are particularly important for us to figure out how to analyze. That's risk and uncertainty. Now, we could talk a lot about the stochastic analysis that we do in the IRP, and for some of you that are engineers, we could talk about Latin hypercube sampling and how we get all those statistics worked into the model, but most everybody's eyes would glaze over if you haven't already just hearing me say Latin hypercube sampling. So instead, I want to talk to you about a cup of coffee, because I think that's a better way to understand risk and uncertainty. So here's how to think about risk. Right now today, we know what we all pay for a cup of coffee. It's actually shocking. My dad couldn't possibly believe how much I pay for a cup of coffee at Starbucks. But we know what their price is right now. We don't know what their price is going to be 20 years from now. So we have to be able to forecast very carefully that price, and that price is a risk because we don't really know what that number is. Well, that's one piece of the puzzle, but the truth is, we don't even know if that cup of coffee will be there in 20 years. That's the uncertainty piece. So we have to apply both of those factors when we look long-term at what's our best resource plan. So we consider both risk and uncertainty as part of this planning exercise. Now, the heart of the IRP uses something called scenario analysis, and I promise I'm not going to make your head hurt too much, but I am going to turn you into a planner for like 5 minutes, okay? So scenario analysis means that we're not trying to predict the future. What we're trying to do is imagine multiple alternative futures that are likely. And then we need to test our business strategies in those multiple futures, because we want to be successful regardless of how the future turns out. Because the one thing we know for sure about the future is we don't know anything about the future. So scenario analysis helps us to bound our possibilities by allowing us to think about a bunch of different futures. So the left-hand side of that slide lists the 5 alternative futures, the scenarios as we call them, that we use in the IRP. I'm going to talk to you just briefly about those. We start with the current outlook, which, just like it sounds, is our current view of the future. Then we have 2 futures that are related to the general economy. One assumes the economy remains stagnant, sputters along, never does really recover. And the other one assumes that we actually do get a growing economy. Then we have 2 special futures, one that looks at a particularly aggressive application of a carbon penalty and how that affects utility planning. And then the last one there, the distributed marketplace, is our attempt to reflect the growing reality that our customers want to serve some or most of their load themselves. And so in the industrial sector, we imagine a lot of gas-fired generation that's placed at the customer site. And for residential and commercial customers, we envision that's primarily, let's say, solar that people like to put on the top of their house. So that future assumes that TVA has less responsibility to serve electric demand than we normally would. And the shape of that electric demand looks different. So that challenges the way that we do planning. So those are the futures. Now what we've got to do is test our strategies. So the right-hand side of that slide has the 5 strategies on it. The reference plan is kind of what it sounds like. This is sort of utility planner speak for everything gets to play, no special objectives. The model chooses least cost, and everything's on the table. The other 4 of those strategies are also intended to lead us to a least cost plan. And by the way, when we talk about least cost, we mean all the costs to serve our customers' requirements over the entire 20-year period. So we're talking about all the fixed costs, all the operating costs, all the fuel costs, everything. So all of these do least cost, but the other 4 do least cost with an added objective. So for example, B up there says, find me the least cost plan, but your emission rate has to be lower than it otherwise would be for the system. So we set an emission target. In strategy C, we said, okay, find me the least cost plan, but TVA can't invest any capital in generating assets. Then D and E both emphasize one particular component of our strategy. One says, maximize my energy efficiency, so use that resource first, use it all up, then choose other things. And in the Maximize Renewables plan, we say, all right, we're going to set what amounts to a portfolio standard. We're going to require a certain amount of renewables to be in our portfolio. The model finds the least cost plan that meets that target. So we take these 5 strategies and we evaluate them in each of those 5 scenarios, and that produces 25 20-year resource plans. But then, as I said, because we know there's risk and uncertainty around those plans, we apply that uncertainty analysis I talked about, which really amounts to a random draw of all of our assumptions over again, because we know, for example, we know what we think natural gas prices are going to be. We also know there's an uncertainty range around those, so we create a probability distribution around all those values. I feel like is a fairly robust, good broad range of demand, which means our alternative cases give us a good sense of where we think the future might take us. So we have all that data. We've looked at all those alternative futures. Now we got to find a way to communicate that information other than carrying the hand truck full of computer printouts into the room and starting to talk about individual pieces of data. So one of the things we do in the IRP, and this is the same thing we actually did in the 2011 study, is that we create a scorecard And that scorecard is built, in this case, around 5 key criteria that we think are the most important attributes. And we score all those plans against these attributes. So let me talk to you about these 5 criteria or these metrics that we use to help us understand the IRP. Cost is the first one. We look at 2 different kinds of costs. We look at the long-term cost over the entire 20 years to serve all that customer demand. Then we also look at a shorter-term cost. And somebody told me earlier in one of these other meetings that my definition of short isn't the same as theirs because I'm a planner, see? So short for me is 10 years. So we're looking at the first 10 years of the study and trying to assess whether the cost of that plan is going to put upward or downward pressure on our overall rates. Now, the IRP doesn't do rate design and it doesn't set rates, but it can give us an indication about what direction it's going. So that's what we're doing in cost. Financial risk is really about trying to get a handle on, over that long period of time, do we think the cost of this plan is more likely to go up or go down over time? So that's what the financial risk indicators help us look at. The environmental stewardship bucket is about more than compliance. It's about looking at the characteristics, kind of the footprint of each of these plans. We use 3 metrics to help us understand that. Water consumption, air emissions, which we use CO2 actually as a proxy for those, and solid waste generation primarily around coal ash and coal residuals. So we're looking at something that helps us understand how we're impacting the environmental, the general quality of the environment in the valley. Valley economics is a macroeconomic kind of view of the valley's economy. So we use a special tool to help us assess when I make a decision about a generating asset, like a gas plant versus a solar farm. How do those 2 affect the economy in the valley? And they affect it differently. And so the model helps us track what happens to employment and people's disposable income, and are people moving in or out of the valley depending on what happens to the price of electricity as a result of this decision we've made about generating resources. So we measure valley-wide economics at that kind of high level to give us a sense about whether we're continuing to support our economic development mission. And then lastly, we look at a metric called flexibility. This is kind of new for us. It's actually a new metric. A number of utilities around the country are looking at this. This is our attempt to make sure that our resource portfolios are flexible enough that they can respond to uncertainties in customer demand. That's becoming increasingly more important as the mixture of our generation fleet moves away from resources that we can directly control as TVA, like central station power plants, and moves more to being things that are more dispersed, like small solar installations or energy efficiency, something that happens, in fact, more on the local power company system, perhaps, maybe than it does on ours. So as that mix begins to change, we need to understand whether the system retains its ability to respond effectively to that load uncertainty. So that's what this flexibility metric is trying to help us measure. So if we take those metrics and use them kind of as a lens, and we look at those nearly 2,000 cases that I talked about a minute ago, then what is it we've learned so far? Well, in cost, we've learned that at the end of the day, over that long view, that 20-year view of cost, all these plans are pretty much the same on total cost. There's not a big winner or a big loser. But when we use our system average cost metric, that one that looks at 10 years, and so we actually have 2 of those, obviously, one that looks at the first 10 years, one that looks at the back 10 years, that in the second 10 years of our study, absent anything we might do about rate structures and the way we recover costs, it looks like those plans that have more renewables and energy efficiency in them might tend to put upward pressure on rates in that back 10-year period. In financial risk, all those plans score pretty close in that metric, except for those plans that emphasize one particular kind of resource. And in those cases, kind of like it does with our personal financial portfolios. If you get invested in pork bellies and that market goes bad, then you're at risk for that amount of your portfolio. So we're seeing the same thing happen in our generation fleet. If we get overly invested in one particular kind of technology, that limits our ability to be responsive, and so our risk metric actually goes up. All the plans have excellent environmental performance, and again, Chuck is going to talk to you more about that here. The wind blows when it does, and the sun shines when it does, and absent really effective utility scale storage, which isn't quite on the market yet, those resources make, the more of those we have, the harder time we'll have being flexible. Our resource choices, as I said at the beginning, really set us in a new direction. All of our scenarios are going to require new generation. Now, they come in different times. The scenarios that have very low load growth, for example, we don't build much until, or add much until out at the end. But we don't see any future where we won't add something. We see natural gas, as I said, playing a much bigger role than it has before. We don't see a requirement for new baseload generation beyond the completion of Watts Bar 2. And there's some small power uprates, about 300 megawatts worth of power uprates, that the model selects at our Browns Ferry nuclear station. We are going to see more energy efficiency and more renewables than we have in our portfolio right now. And we see them sooner, and we see a larger volume of those. And our fleet's going to be cleaner. This chart is showing you the mix of our generation portfolio by the time we get to the end of the planning period, which right now is 2033. So let me tell you about what you're looking at on this slide. The bar at the top is our current portfolio, shown as grouped by fuel type. So that bar actually ties back to that slide I showed you a few minutes ago that has where our current fleet is. And then the other 5 bars are the long-term, by the time we get all the way to the end, what are these 5 strategies going to do to our power mix? So let me talk to you about some takeaways from this chart. Number 1, you're going to see that nuclear, the green bar, goes up just a little bit. That's Watts Bar 2, and those power uprates at Browns Ferry. The red bar, at the same time, is going down. That's our coal fleet. I've already mentioned, we're committed to retiring additional coal assets. Natural gas, hydro pretty much stays the same. That's kind of the darker blue bar there. Natural gas is going to play a bigger role, and you see that in the light colored blue bar that's significantly bigger than where we are right now. A lot of that natural gas is peaking power. It's simple cycle combustion turbines. Don't operate very often, but we need them to ensure reliability. So that's part of the reason that segment shows a big growth. And then the last 2, the yellow and the purple bars, represent our renewables and our energy efficiency and demand response. And you'll notice that all those strategies show more of those 2 resources than where we are right now. And if you look at the 2 where, the one where we maximize energy efficiency obviously has the biggest purple bar, and the one where we maximize renewables has the biggest yellow bar. And you notice that kind of what's trading off there is natural gas. So what we're seeing is kind of the active players in our strategies are renewables, energy efficiency, and natural gas. And they move around depending on what scenario we're looking at. Now, at the end of the day, regardless of what we like to do as planners, we love to run analysis. Eventually, we need to make a recommendation. That's what we hope to be able to do with our board later in the summer. When we do that, we try to keep in mind these 3 things, which our customers tell us all the time are their most important criteria. Number 1, that the power's got to be affordable. Number 2, it's got to be reliable, and that's reliable, not only the supply has to be reliable, but our ability to deliver it has to be reliable. So our transmission system becomes important in that particular criteria. And then lastly, the portfolio mix needs to be diverse enough that we're protected from some of the uncertainty in the future. But at the same time, our customers have said to us, get us a good portfolio, but let's not pollute the whole valley while you're doing it. So part of our environmental impact also rolls into that last criteria around the mix. So that's kind of a high-level summary of what we've learned in the Integrated Resource Plan. I'm going to ask Chuck Nicholson to come up now. Chuck's our NEPA specialist, and Chuck's going to talk to us a little bit about
Environmental Policy and Compliance Specialist at TVA. I manage the portion of this whole process that involves putting together this environmental impact statement. This is the third one of the IRP environmental impact statements I've worked on, and I'm going to really continue to be interesting and challenging projects. So a little bit about the purpose of the environmental impact statement and the approach to the environmental impact statement. The National Environmental Policy Act requires that federal agencies, as they are getting ready to make a decision on some action, that federal agencies study and be aware of the potential environmental impacts of that action, and then use that information as well as other types of information in ultimately making the decision. Another important aspect of National Environmental Policy Act compliance is public involvement. That's part of the reason why you all are here tonight. In this environmental impact statement, air quality. The primary focus on air quality is emissions of carbon dioxide, emissions of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and mercury. We're also looking at carbon dioxide emissions, carbon dioxide being one of the main greenhouse gases. Water resources, the focus on water resources is on the water that our generating plants use, primarily for cooling, as well as water consumption, the water that we extract and primarily evaporate in the process of cooling our thermal plants, water consumption. Fuel requirements, how much fuel, how many tons of coal are we going to need in the future, how many billion cubic standard feet of natural gas, how many tons of uranium. So, and the fuel consumption, obviously there's impacts from extracting and transporting the fuel as well as disposing of the spent fuel. So the metric for the amount of fuel is an indicator of some of those other types of impacts related to the fuel cycle. Waste production, that's primarily the production of coal ash and the residue that comes out of our sulfur dioxide scrubbers in the coal plants. We also discussed spent nuclear fuel, but that, as Jerry hinted, we're not adding new nuclear, so the proportion of nuclear energy and nuclear energy generation over the life of this plant remains pretty constant. So really, that particular environmental thing doesn't tell us very much. It doesn't change much over time there. Land requirements, that's the amount of land required to build the new generating facilities that we're going to need under the different strategies there. So we're looking at, in a couple of ways, the acreage occupied by the new generating facilities, and then another little twist is looking at more life cycle land requirements, particularly the land disturbed by the fuel process, by mining, by drilling, by transporting and processing fuels, and then disposing of the spent fuels on the tail end there. And then a couple of economic indicators there. The effect of implementation of the plan on overall employment within the TVA region and per capita income in the TVA region. So we'll briefly go over a few results and some of the trends under the different alternative strategies. The chart shows these are the changes in emissions of carbon dioxide under the 5 strategies, which are listed across the bottom there. And you see no action. We've got 6 things listed here. In an environmental impact statement, one of the things we have to do is compare what the impacts of these different strategies against what the impacts would be if we continued on our present course of action without making a change. So that's what we call a no action alternative. That's our continued implementation of the Integrated Resource Plan that we adopted in 2011, as it's since been modified as we've implemented our annual budgets and our board of directors has made decisions on things like retirement of a couple of our coal units up at Paradise Plain in Kentucky, as well as the decision to construct and operate some new gas-fired combined cycle plants that Gary referred to. The overall shapes are very similar to this chart here. I'm not going to show you each of those, but they're very similar to that. And in all of these, most of the reductions of these things in the early part of the period are due to the retirement of several of our code units that we already are committed to and are going to happen regardless of which of the strategies we ultimately choose. So some kind of take-home observations there. We've got long-term decreases in air emissions, in carbon dioxide emissions, water use and consumption, and in coal use and ash production, long-term decreases in those. The difference in all those among the 5 strategies are quite small, relatively small. There is a larger difference among the strategies in the land requirements for building the new generating facilities, with the maximized renewable strategies having the largest total land requirements. The reason for that is it adds the largest amount of solar generation, photovoltaic panels take a relatively large amount of area proportionate to the amount of energy they produce. So, for example, in a nuclear plant, you can get a very large amount of energy out of a relatively small area of acres. Under a solar plant, it takes a lot more land area to produce the same amount of energy. So, the maximized renewables has the largest land requirements. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary.
Okay, so let's talk about where we are right now. We're in Huntsville, Alabama. But in the project, we're here in the present findings phase, where we've put the draft IRP and supplemental EIS out. I know everybody has downloaded it, right? Got it at home on your bedside table. Right? Mine's under my pillow. I sleep with it on. There you go. See, we got one. So we're now going around and taking input on the draft. Our objective is to gather all that input, and then we'll review our results. We'll review all those comments, decide if we need to do additional analysis, along with some sensitivity work that our stakeholders have already asked us to do. And we'll merge all that into a final report. And then that will ultimately go to our board of directors, as I said, probably, in August. We'll be asking them to vote on the recommendations and the power supply mix that we have outlined in the IRP. So we are on the road show right now. We started March the 13th when comment period opened. It closes on April the 27th. So we're here in Huntsville tonight. You see that we're headed next week to Tupelo and Memphis, and then the week after that to Nashville, and we'll wrap up in Bowling Green. Ways to do that. We have a website, of course, where you can give us comments electronically. We have comment cards here tonight in the back of the room that you can write comments on. We have a computer set up in the back of the room so that you can give us your comment online if you'd like. You can go home and email us the comments. There's 2 kinds of comments that we take in this process. The ones that you'll make at the microphone tonight are informal comments. We're going to capture the general point that you're making, and we'll do our best to answer your questions tonight. But those will not appear in the official record. So if you want your comment or your question to be in the official record as part of this process, we have to have it in writing. So you're going to have to put it on a card or email it to us or something like that.